It's 1994 and a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt is standing on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, squinting into the afternoon light. The landscape around him is the kind of quiet that gets inside you. Rolling limestone hills, sparse scrub, the distant shimmer of the Karahan plain stretching toward the Syrian border. The region around Urfa, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, is full of ancient things. Ruins hiding under fields, pottery sherds turning up in ploughed soil, the general sense that the ground here has been remembering things for a very long time. Schmidt had been here before, briefly, following up on survey notes from American researchers who had passed through decades earlier. They had noted the site, called it probably a medieval cemetery, and moved on. The scattered stones on the hilltop looked like grave markers, the kind of thing that gets flagged, logged, and left alone. But Schmidt stands there looking at those stones and something is not sitting right. Medieval grave markers don't look like this. They don't feel like this. The hill itself has an unusual shape, almost too symmetrical in places, as if the mound isn't just a mound, as if something underneath is pushing the geometry from below. He starts walking the surface slowly, the way you do when you're not sure what you're looking for, but you know you'll recognize it when you see it. The limestone fragments scattered across the ground are everywhere, broken and worn by millennia of weather. But then he picks one up and stops. The carved surface is unmistakable, not the rough break of a natural stone, not the simple shaping of a medieval craftsman. This is deliberate, controlled, the kind of work that takes intention and time and skill. And then he sees the T-shape, a large piece of limestone partially buried with a form that clearly wasn't accidental, a tall vertical shaft capped by a wider horizontal bar. The proportions are too careful, the angles too consistent to be anything other than the result of a conscious design. He's seen enough carved stone in enough places to know that this is something different, something much older than anyone has catalogued here, something that does not belong to any period his colleagues had associated with this hill. He would later describe the moment as immediately clear to him that this was not a cemetery, that this was a place of another kind entirely. What Schmidt couldn't fully appreciate yet, standing there in 1994 with the wind moving through the scrub and the plain laid out below him, was exactly how far back this place reached. The formal excavations he would begin the following year and continue until his death in 2014 would eventually reveal that the hilltop he was standing on had been intentionally built up layer by layer over thousands of years, that the T-shaped stones were not isolated curiosities but part of massive circular enclosures, that the site had been constructed, used, and then deliberately, carefully, purposefully buried, as if whoever built it decided one day that it needed to go back into the earth. And the dates, when they came, were the part that made the scientific world pause and look again at everything it thought it knew. The layers at the very bottom of the site reach back to around 9,600 BC. That's not a typo and it's not a rounding error. We're talking about roughly 11,500 years ago. Now here is why that number is so strange, why it sits in the middle of the archaeological record like a stone dropped into still water. In 9,600 BC, according to everything we thought we understood about the human story, people in this part of the world were hunter-gatherers. They didn't have pottery, they didn't have writing. There is no evidence that agriculture, the domestication of wheat and barley and goats and cattle, had yet taken hold in the region. The standard model of history, the one most of us learned, goes something like this. First people settle down, then they farm, then they build surpluses, then they develop organized religion and monumental architecture and all the social complexity that comes with it. You need enough people with enough food and enough time to organize a building project at this scale. That's the logic. That's how it's supposed to work. And then you have Göbekli Tepe, a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, covered in massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 50 tons, arranged in careful circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs, constructed and maintained over what appears to be centuries, all by people who, on paper, weren't supposed to be capable of it yet. The temple came before the town. The monument came before the village. The ritual, or whatever this place represents, apparently came before the recipe. That inversion is what makes Göbekli Tepe one of the most genuinely disorienting discoveries in the history of archaeology, and we're only part-way through understanding it. The excavations have so far uncovered a fraction of what ground-penetrating radar suggests lies beneath the surface. There are more enclosures down there, more pillars, more questions. Each layer of soil pulled back reveals not answers so much as better-formed questions, which is honestly the most exciting state for a mystery to be in. If you're lying in bed right now, somewhere quiet, maybe with a dark ceiling above you and the sound of the night outside your window, I want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Seriously. It's one of my favourite things about these videos, that it's 4 in the morning in Melbourne and 11 at night in Oslo, and someone's drifting off in a São Paulo apartment, all at the same time. Leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and if you want to hear this kind of thing without any interruptions, you can follow the show on Spotify. The link is in the description. No ads, no music underneath it, just the history and the dark and wherever your mind goes when you let it wander. It genuinely helps keep this going. Now let's go back to that hilltop. Let's go back to what Klaus Schmidt found when the real digging began, and what it meant that the deeper they went, the stranger and more ancient and more deliberately constructed everything became. To understand why Göbekli Tepe is so unsettling, you have to spend a moment actually inhabiting the world it was built in. Not as an abstract date on a timeline, but as a lived reality. Because 9600 BC is a phrase that moves through the mind very quickly, and if you let it move too quickly, you miss what it actually means. Upper Mesopotamia at that time sits at the tail end of a period called the Younger Dryas. For roughly 1,000 years before this, the climate had been doing something deeply uncooperative. After the last ice age began loosening its grip, there was a sudden cold snap, a return to near-glacial conditions that lasted long enough to reshape landscapes, push animal populations around, and force the humans living through it into patterns of movement and survival that we can only partially reconstruct. The Younger Dryas ended around 9700 BC, give or take a century, so the people building at Göbekli Tepe were living in the immediate aftermath of that shift, in a period when the climate was warming again, when the Fertile Crescent was becoming somewhat more hospitable, when wild grasses and game animals were recovering and spreading across landscapes that had been harsher living just a few generations earlier. Now it would be too simple to say the end of the Younger Dryas caused Göbekli Tepe, and archaeologists are careful not to make that claim. Climate creates conditions, it opens or closes possibilities, it doesn't build things. Whatever was happening on that hilltop was the result of human decisions, human organisation, human intention. But the climatic backdrop matters for picturing the world these people actually moved through. It was a world in transition, slowly, unevenly, in ways no one living then could have fully perceived. There was no farming here yet. That's the key fact, and it's worth sitting with. The domestication of einkorn wheat, one of the crops that would eventually anchor agriculture in this region, is thought to have begun somewhere in the Karahan mountains, which are actually visible from Göbekli Tepe on a clear day. But at 9600 BC, that process was still in its earlier stages, or perhaps not yet underway at all, depending on which researchers you read. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew across the slopes of the Fertile Crescent. People knew these plants. They harvested them, processed them, depended on them seasonally. But they hadn't yet crossed the threshold into deliberate cultivation, systematic planting, the management of fields across years and generations. That distinction between intensive foraging and true agriculture is a real one, even if the line between them was blurry at the time and is still debated by specialists now. What pre-agriculture practically means, in terms of daily life, is that these were people who moved, not aimlessly, not chaotically, but in patterns shaped by where the resources were at different times of year. You follow the herds in autumn. You return to certain river valleys when the wild grains ripen. You know exactly which stands of pistachio and almond are worth the walk in early summer. This kind of knowledge, accumulated over generations, is extraordinarily sophisticated. It encodes seasons, landscapes, plant cycles, animal behavior, water sources, and weather signs into a living body of understanding that gets passed down and refined and added to over lifetimes. The assumption that these people were somehow operating without complex thought, without planning, without the capacity for organization, is not one that the evidence supports. Their tools were stone. This is what pre-pottery, pre-metallurgical life looks like at the material level. Flint napped into blades and points and scrapers, bone and wood and plant fibre for everything else, no wheels, no metal, no fired clay vessels for storage. This matters architecturally because the tools available for carving and shaping the massive limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe were essentially the same tools these people used for everything else. Flint picks and hammer stones and whatever leverage they could improvise from wood and rope made from plant fibre. And yet the results, the smoothed surfaces, the controlled animal reliefs, the shaped T-forms standing 4 or 5 meters tall and weighing multiple tons, were produced with exactly that toolkit, which tells you something about patience, about the accumulation of skilled labour over long periods of time, about a level of commitment to a project that goes far beyond what survival strictly requires. There was no writing. This one is easy to state and hard to fully absorb. Nothing that happened at Göbekli Tepe was recorded in text. No one wrote down the rules for the ceremonies. No one inscribed the names of the people who carved the stones. Whatever was known about this place, whatever meanings the animal carvings carried, whatever instructions existed for how to use the enclosures, all of it was held in human memory and passed through spoken language and demonstrated practice. That's not a limitation so much as a reminder that human minds were storing and transmitting enormous amounts of complex information long before anyone invented a way to write it down. The oral traditions of pre-literate societies are not primitive. They are, in some ways, extraordinary feats of collective memory operating across generations without any external record to fall back on. The people of 9,600 BC in this region were probably organized into groups of somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred individuals, bands that came together and separated as conditions required, kinship networks that stretched across the landscape, connecting communities that might only see each other at certain times of year, at resource-rich locations or at places that held social and perhaps ritual significance. There is good ethnographic evidence from hunter-gatherer societies studied in the last few centuries that gatherings of this kind, large seasonal aggregations of normally dispersed bands, serve crucial social functions. They're where marriages are arranged, where disputes are settled, where knowledge is exchanged, where stories are told and ceremonies performed. These events require organization. They require someone or some group who understands how to coordinate the logistics of feeding and housing many people for an extended period. They are not simple, which brings us to the expectation that most of us carried, probably without even realizing we carried it. The textbook version of the human story has a particular sequence built into it. First agriculture, then surplus, then population growth, then specialization, then the kind of organized social complexity that produces monumental architecture. Temples and pyramids and stone circles come near the end of this sequence, not the beginning. They are supposed to be the products of civilizations already established, already fed, already organized. The logic seems reasonable. Building something like Göbekli Tepe requires coordinating large numbers of workers, feeding them while they work, making decisions about design and placement, and sustaining the project across what the evidence suggests was many generations. How do you do any of that without a stable agricultural base? How do you organize that level of collective labor when your subsistence depends on hunting and moving? This is the question the site forces into the open, and the honest answer at this point is that we don't fully know. But the question itself may be revealing a flaw in the model more than a paradox in the evidence. Our categories, agriculture versus foraging, settled versus mobile, civilized versus primitive, are tools we invented after the fact to make sense of a very long and very complicated human story. The people living at the edge of the Younger Dryas didn't know they were supposed to wait for farming before they built anything significant. They were doing what humans do, which is responding to whatever they understood about the world they lived in, using whatever social and material resources they had, creating meaning and structure in ways that made sense to them. The landscape around the site was rich. The fertile crescent at the opening of the Holocene was thick with wild game. Gazelle, aurochs, wild boar, deer. The slopes were covered in wild grains. The rivers ran with fish. This is not a marginal environment populated by desperate people scratching for calories. This was one of the most resource-dense regions in the ancient world, and the people who knew it intimately may have had more organizational capacity and more available time than the standard model gives them credit for. Whatever the full explanation turns out to be, Göbekli Tepe asks us to consider that the transition from forager to farmer was not a clean before and after, and that the social and cognitive and perhaps spiritual capacities that produced monumental architecture did not suddenly emerge once the first seeds were planted. Those capacities were already there, already operating, already building things in stone on a hilltop that would last 11,000 years longer than anyone who built them could possibly have imagined. So let's go back to the excavations, and to what Schmidt and his team found when they started pulling back the surface of that too symmetrical hill. For a long time, that hill was nothing more than a line on a survey map. Local farmers knew it as a good place to graze animals. Shepherds walked over it. Pottery sherds lay on the surface, the kind you get all over southeastern Turkey from the last few thousand years of settlement and resettlement. In the 1960s, when a joint Turkish-American survey team came through and catalogued the archaeology of the region, they noted the mound, saw the pottery, and did what any reasonable person trained in the expectations of the time would do. They classified it as the eroded remains of some fairly ordinary, fairly late site. Maybe a Byzantine outpost, maybe an Iron Age settlement, one mortel among thousands. The misreading wasn't sloppy work. It was model-driven work. When you walk a landscape that has been occupied for 8,000 or 9,000 years of literate history, and you see a rounded mound with bits of later pottery on top, the safe assumption is that you're looking at an artificial hill built up by those later people. That's what a tell is. Layer upon layer of mud brick houses, floors, trash pits, collapsed walls, all accumulating into a soft, rounded rise. If you're expecting Bronze Age or Iron Age material, that's what your eyes are tuned to see. What no one in the 1960s was looking for, because no one really believed it existed, was a monumental stone complex from the 10th millennium BC, hiding inside something that looked so utterly normal. Klaus Schmidt was not the first archaeologist to stand on Göbekli Tepe, but he was the first one who refused to be satisfied with the standard label. In the mid-1990s, working on his doctoral research, he was studying early Neolithic sites in the region, places like Nevelachori, where T-shaped pillars with simple carvings had already turned up in proper excavations. When he read the old survey report and saw a note about worked stone and mound with sherds on that lonely hill, he decided to take a closer look. On the surface there were hints if you knew what to look for. Pieces of limestone that weren't quite natural. Fragments that showed the edges of relief carving. To most people they looked like any other scattered stones. To someone who had been staring at pre-pottery Neolithic pillars for years, they looked eerily familiar. So Schmidt did the thing that changes a hill from a guess into a problem. He put in a trench. The first season was cautious. Narrow cuts into the slope, careful removal of the plough soil, slow work with trowels and brushes. At first it was what you'd expect. Loose stones, mixed material, the usual chaos of a disturbed surface. Then, as the trenches deepened, the pattern sharpened. Curving lines of heavy limestone blocks, a wall but not a domestic one, not the mud brick house foundations you'd see in later tells. These stones were different, more deliberate. They formed a circular outline, and inside that outline the tops of something larger. When the first T-shaped pillar heads emerged from the soil, it was like seeing the roofline of a buried building. Flat horizontal caps, squared edges, rising out of the fill. Then the vertical faces began to appear, and with them the carvings. A fox, a vulture, lines too clean to be natural fractures. All of it in stone that, as far as anyone knew then, should not have been shaped this way until thousands of years later. One pillar could be an anomaly. Two could be a coincidence. But as the seasons went on and more enclosures were traced, the pattern repeated. Great stone rings, central pillars much larger than the ones in the surrounding circle. All carefully arranged, all deliberately buried under tons of backfill. Very quickly it became obvious that this was not a medieval ruin, not a Bronze Age sanctuary, not anything that fit comfortably into the known timeline. To place it, archaeologists turned to the quiet work of dating. At Göbekli Tepe, you can't date the pillars directly. The limestone itself is millions of years old. What you can date are the organic remains sealed in the deposits around them. Bits of charcoal from ancient fires, fragments of animal bone, traces of plant remains caught between stones. Samples went to radiocarbon labs. The numbers that came back were awkward. Instead of the neat cluster around 2,000 or 3,000 BC that a late mound would give you, dates from the deepest layers were clustering around 9,600 BC, 9,500 BC, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later. There was variation, as there always is with radiocarbon, and different labs and different samples have produced slightly different ranges, but the broad picture was unmistakable. These enclosures belong to what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic A, with some later activity extending into the pre-pottery Neolithic B. Those terms sound technical, but the ideas behind them are simple. Neolithic in this part of the world generally means the period when people are experimenting with or adopting farming and more permanent settlements. Pre-pottery means exactly what it sounds like, a time before the routine use of fired clay vessels. So the pre-pottery Neolithic A, or PPNA, roughly spans from about 9,700 to 8,800 BC in this region, depending on the site. It's a time of stone tools, mobile or semi-sedentary communities, the very earliest hints of plant and animal management, and, as Göbekli Tepe shows, surprisingly ambitious architecture. Pre-pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, comes a bit later, into the 8th millennium BC, when you start to see more clearly domesticated plants and animals, more permanent houses, more of what we recognise as village life, still without everyday pottery. The shock wasn't just that Göbekli Tepe belonged to PPNA and early PPNB, it was that the most monumental, most elaborate parts of the site seemed to come from the earlier phase, before the classic package of agriculture and pottery and permanent villages was in place. The sequence was backwards from what many textbooks had implied. To make sense of that sequence, Archaeologists do something that doesn't often get talked about outside the field. They read layers the way historians read documents. Göbekli Tepe is not one moment frozen in time, it's a stack. At the bottom, in what's known as Layer 3, lie the oldest and most massive circular enclosures, with their towering central pillars. Above them, cutting into and overlapping them, is Layer 2, with smaller, more rectangular rooms and lower pillars, likely from the PPNB. Even higher still, or eroded away on the surface, are traces of much later, much more modest activity, people passing through or grazing animals centuries or millennia afterward. Each layer represents not just a date, but a decision. To build, to rebuild, to cover over, to change the way the hilltop was used. When Schmidt's team peeled back the soil, they weren't just uncovering stones. They were moving backward through a construction history written in fill and floor and wall. This is why the early misclassification of the mound is, in a way, understandable. If you only ever see the topmost layer, and that layer has some scattered later pottery in it, the older story remains hidden. Only when you cut down through the sequence do the deep time decisions become visible. In a moment, we're going to walk slowly through those decisions. We'll start with Layer 3, with the great stone circles and their paired central pillars, and then trace how later builders modified, reused, and finally buried them. We'll look at the animals carved in high relief, the strange human figures and deliberate absences, the way the architecture itself seems to choreograph movement and attention. All of that is coming, but it begins here, with a hill everyone thought they understood, and the realization, trench by trench, that sometimes the oldest stories lie directly beneath the ones we've been telling ourselves for years. To get a feel for Göbekli Tepe, you have to start at the bottom of that stack. Layer 3 is where the shock lives. This is the oldest architectural phase that archaeologists can confidently trace at the site, broadly dated to around 9,600 to 8,800 BC. The exact numbers wobble a bit depending on which charcoal fragment you measure or how you calibrate your radiocarbon curve, but all the reasonable ranges plant it firmly at the very beginning of the Neolithic story in this region, when the Ice Age climate had only just relaxed, when farming was at best a set of experiments carried out in a few lucky valleys. And on top of this bare limestone ridge, people decided to carve circles into stone. Layer 3 is dominated by a handful of large, almost circular or slightly oval enclosures. Archaeologists label them with letters, enclosure A, B, C, D, but that's just bookkeeping. On the ground, each one is its own world. Imagine standing in the middle of one of these spaces once all the soil is gone. You're not looking at a pile of ruins, you're inside a plan. Around you, following a curve that's almost but not quite perfect, runs a perimeter wall made of stacked limestone blocks. Set against that wall, like teeth in a jaw, stand a ring of T-shaped pillars. They're not all the same. Some are taller, some shorter, some more carefully finished than others. Many of them have shallow relief carvings, foxes slipping along the edges, snakes, boars, wild birds. Between the pillars, in the gaps, there are low bench-like features, or niches cut into the wall. The circle closes around you, embracing the space. And in the middle, dominating everything, stand two much larger monoliths. These central pillars are the giants of Layer 3. In Enclosure D, the most famous of the excavated rings, they rise over 5 meters tall. Each is a single block of the local limestone quarried from the bedrock just upslope, levered out, dressed and hauled into position. They stand opposite each other across the centre of the circle, like a pair of gateposts that no one ever meant to walk between. Their broad faces are turned inward, toward the space and toward each other. From above, the geometry is clear. Ring of smaller stones, pair of giants in the centre, everything aligned on axes that feel deliberate even if we can't fully decode their meaning. From ground level, what you notice first is the mass. Limestone is heavy even in small pieces. Here, the central stones in some enclosures weigh 15, 30, perhaps up to 50 tons in the largest examples. They don't look like stone someone happened to find and prop upright. They look like decisions. For a long time, it was tempting to call them posts or slabs, but a closer look changes that. The T-shape is not an accident of quarrying. It's a design. The vertical shaft narrows slightly toward the top, then flares into a horizontal crosspiece. On many pillars, especially the central pair, you can see carved details that turn these blocks from abstract architecture into highly stylized bodies. Along the narrow edges of the shafts, shallow arms bend downwards, hands meeting in front. On some, a belt runs around the waist, complete with buckle and sometimes a dangling loincloth or fox pelt. On others, you can see a necklace, or a series of horizontal bands that might be clothing or ornament. The head of the T has no face, no eyes, no mouth, but that absence itself seems meaningful. It's as if the blocks have shoulders, chests, hips, but whatever would have occupied the top is left intentionally blank. Most archaeologists now interpret these T-shapes as highly abstracted human figures, not just anonymous humans either. The scale, the central placement, the belts and accessories all suggest that the two tallest pillars in each ring may represent beings of special status, ancestors, spirits, deities. However, the people of 9600 BC might have understood them. The perimeter pillars, smaller but sharing the same basic form, become a crowd, a gathering of presences standing attentively around the centre. So layer 3 is not just architecture, it's a stone congregation. If all of this had been built in a single burst, a few inspired years when a community poured its energy into one hilltop, you might imagine a charismatic leader, a single visionary generation, some extraordinary event. But the evidence on the ground points to something slower, more layered. When archaeologists excavate the floors and fills of these enclosures, they find signs that construction and use were not one-off moments. Walls are patched and thickened. Pillars are reset. Some enclosures cut slightly into the spaces of others. The radiocarbon dates from different parts of the same ring sometimes show spreads of centuries. All of this hints that these circles were living projects, built and modified in episodes. An enclosure might begin as a rougher circle, with a certain number of pillars. Later more stones could be added, or carved in greater detail. A bench might be built along a particular arc. A floor might be resurfaced. Eventually, for reasons we don't yet understand, the whole thing would be deliberately filled in with rubble and earth, sealed like a time capsule, and on top of that, perhaps a new enclosure would begin. The hill, in other words, was not sculpted once and abandoned. It was curated, maintained, layered. This implies something that's easy to miss when you're just looking at photographs of carved animals: continuity. To build even one of these rings, quarrying multi-ton stones from bedrock, shaping them with stone tools, dragging them to the site, raising them, carving their surfaces, you need planning and coordination to keep coming back for generations, to refurbish, to rebuild, to remember which stone goes where and why. You need more than that. You need tradition. Pause for a moment in the quiet of that imaginary enclosure. Feel the limestone under your bare feet. It's cool, even in warm air, the way dense stone always is. The wind coming off the plateau brushes the tops of the standing pillars, threads through the narrow gaps, makes soft, irregular sounds against the edges. Light falls in a broken ring around the base of each T, throwing long shadows that curve and intersect on the floor. The geometry isn't perfect in a mathematical sense, but it's careful. People checked alignments by eye, adjusted, stepped back, tried again. Everything about this space says somebody cared about how it felt to stand here. And yet, when these enclosures were first being built, the people organising all this work were not living in stone houses with storerooms and grain silos, at least not here. The settlement traces around Göbekli Tepe are faint compared to the monumentality of the circles. There are hearths, scatters of flint tools, piles of animal bones from feasts, but nothing like the dense village plans of later Neolithic sites. The builders seem to have come to the hill from elsewhere, gathered, worked, performed whatever activities the rings demanded, and then dispersed again. This is one of the reasons Göbekli Tepe has become a lightning rod. How do hunter-gatherers, or people on the edge of farming still very much tied to wild game and seasonal plants, organise the quarrying, transport and erection of 10, 20, 50-ton stones? How do they sustain a building program that unfolds over centuries? Who remembers the stories that tell you why this pillar faces that one, and why the belt on this central figure must be carved in just this way? Some researchers think the answer lies in ritual gatherings, a kind of seasonal pilgrimage site, where scattered groups who hunted in different valleys and walked different migration routes converge to reaffirm ties, exchange goods, arrange marriages, and participate in shared ceremonies. The labour to raise a pillar becomes part of the ceremony. The architecture itself becomes a map of relationships between clans or lineages, carved in limestone instead of knotted in string. Others push further, suggesting that projects like Göbekli Tepe required new forms of leadership, specialists who directed work, maybe even early versions of priests. Still others see in the complexity of the rings the fingerprints of what they like to call instruction, the idea that some lost civilization, now vanished without convincing physical trace, must have come along and taught these foragers how to build. The problem with that last idea is not that it's inherently impossible, but that it isn't necessary. When you look across the archaeological record, you see that humans, even in very small mobile groups, are perfectly capable of organising large communal projects when the social incentives are strong enough. Earthworks, stone rows, songlines, elaborate wooden structures in places where stone is scarce. We don't have to import a forgotten global culture to explain why people on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, at the end of the last ice age, decided to make circles of stone. What Layer 3 demands we explain is something both more modest and more profound. Not a single moment of genius, but a commitment. The willingness of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people across many lifetimes to keep investing in one hill, to keep walking back up that slope, generation after generation, bringing stone and food and stories, to build and rebuild rings whose meanings we can only glimpse from the surviving carvings. Someone had to remember when to return. Someone had to decide which enclosure would be renewed and which would be filled in and closed. Someone had to teach the children which pillar represented which being, and why the arms are always carved along the narrow edge, and what it meant that the heads are left blank. So when we talk about Layer 3 and its great circles, we're not just talking about architecture, we're talking about social memory. As we move deeper into the site, into the central pair of pillars, into the animals that crowd along their flanks, into the strange, almost human figures that appear and disappear in the carvings, keep that in mind. Behind every fox and vulture cut into limestone lies a network of people who agreed, over and over again, that this place mattered enough to shape. In a bit we'll look more closely at that central pair, and at what their silent, faceless bodies might be trying to say about the people who raised them. And if this kind of slow, deep history is the sort of thing that helps you drift off at night, there's a longer, expanded version of tonight's story in book form at sleepytimehistory.com, with a discount running this week. But for now, stay with the stones and let the circle close around you. Let's walk back into Enclosure D for a moment And this time, don't look around the ring. Look straight ahead. Those two central pillars have numbers now. Pillar 18 and Pillar 31. Clinical, almost bureaucratic labels pinned onto stones that were already old when the first pottery was still 10,000 years away. But the numbers at least let us talk about them clearly. Pillar 18 stands slightly off-centre, its broad face turned toward Pillar 31 across the enclosure. They are not mirror images, but they are clearly a pair. Each rises a little over 5.5 metres, the height of a 2-storey house, and each is cut from a single block of limestone. Estimates of their weight run to 40 or 50 tons. That's the mass of a fully loaded semi-truck, balanced upright on a footprint only a few feet across. Stand at the base of one in your mind. The shaft climbs above you, narrowing as it goes, then flaring into that horizontal crosspiece. The sides are not rough quarry faces. They've been dressed, evened, smoothed by patient blows of stone on stone. Along the narrow edge, where you might expect a simple right angle, something more delicate appears. Arms, not in high detail, not carved as separate limbs, but sketched in shallow relief that runs down the length of the pillar, an upper arm slanting from the shoulder, an elbow implied by a change in angle, forearms coming together toward the front. The hands curl around the face of the shaft and meet near the lower third, fingers rendered as small parallel grooves. It is the pose of someone standing upright with hands folded in front, calm, composed, utterly still. Around the waist of each central pillar runs a belt. On Pillar 18, the belt is crisply defined, a horizontal band encircling the stone with a carved buckle on the front. Hanging from the belt is a fox pelt, the animal's body stylized but recognizable, its snout pointing down. On some other pillars at the site, the belts carry daggers or lines that may be fringe or fabric. On Pillar 31, the details differ, but the same pattern holds, a band at the waist, sometimes accompanied by vertical elements that might be loincloths or tunics. Higher up, near what would be the chest and shoulders, you can see additional bands, perhaps necklaces, perhaps the stone echo of clothing seams. Everything about these carvings works together to push your imagination away from rock and toward body. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee. The vertical shaft becomes a torso, the horizontal bar, a headless set of shoulders. The arms along the edges turn the pillar into a figure standing within the space, not just supporting it. Archaeologists talk about these as anthropomorphic beings, stone beings shaped in the image of humans, but not reducible to any particular human face. And that absence of a face is part of the power. The broad top of each T is blank. No eyes peer out, no mouth opens to speak. If there was ever paint or attached material that gave them more character, it has long vanished. What we're left with is a kind of deliberate anonymity. The figures are specific enough to be someone, but abstract enough to be anyone or anything. Your tradition tells you they are. Ancestors, spirits, clan founders, mythic animals walking upright, deities with no direct equivalent in any later pantheon. We don't know. The stones refuse to say. What we can say is that once you stand between pillars 18 and 31, the whole enclosure changes. You're not in a ring of rocks anymore. You're in a room occupied by two silent presences, each many times taller than you, each weighing more than your entire extended family put together. The smaller T-shapes against the wall stop being supports and become a gathered audience. Other figures standing in a circle, turned inward toward the central pair. This is the moment when Göbekli Tepe stops looking like a piece of extreme engineering and starts looking like a stage. Imagine people entering the enclosure along whatever path they used, filing in past the perimeter pillars. Maybe fires burned in shallow hearths. Maybe the floor was swept clean before each gathering. The central pair stand ahead, backlit by the entrance light or looming out of the dusk. Any movement, any voice raised, any song or chant or story told here happens under their gaze. Archaeologists have begun to talk about these circles as performance spaces. Not performance in the modern sense of tickets and audiences, but in the older human sense. Recitations of origin stories, enactments of seasonal rituals, laments for the dead, celebrations of a successful hunt or a new alliance. The acoustics of a stone ring with high central figures would focus sound inward. Words spoken at the centre could carry to everyone along the edge. Gestures made in front of the central pillars would be visible to all. If you think of pillars 18 and 31 as efficients, or as the embodied memory of the group, the design starts to make a different kind of sense. Perhaps certain people stood at their feet to speak for the ancestors. Perhaps processions circle the enclosure, stopping before each smaller pillar in turn, reciting names or totems associated with it, before finally facing the central pair. Perhaps children were brought here to be introduced to the spirits of the hill, their names spoken aloud while hands brush the carved belts and fox pelts. We don't know if any of that happened. What we do know is that these two stones were placed where everyone could see them, carved in ways that mark them as more than architectural supports, and preserved, patched, and ultimately buried with a care that suggests they had stories attached to them. The people who walked here did not just move through a space. They moved through a diagram of their own beliefs, and yet so much is missing. We don't know what the builders called these beings. We don't know the words they used for belt, or fox, or ancestor. We don't know what language flowed through this ring, what metaphors attach themselves to those blank stone shoulders. We can't say whether Pillar 18 was male or female in their terms, or whether such categories even applied to these presences at all. We don't know what promises were made here, what fears were soothed, what memories were recited and then entrusted to the stone. All we can do is read the clues that remain. The way the hands are always carved along the edge, never the front, the way belts and garments cluster at certain heights, the way the central pair in each enclosure echo one another but are never identical, like siblings rather than twins. From a distance, Göbekli Tepe can look like a heap of impressive megaliths. From between pillars 18 and 31, that word, megalith, feels too small. These are not just big stones. They are in some sense people made of stone, or at least vessels for personhood. As we move on to look at where these blocks came from, and how on earth people with no draft animals or metal tools cut and moved them, keep that in the back of your mind. Every groove in the limestone, every centimetre of those carved belts, was made by someone who already knew who these beings were supposed to be, and yet all their names have fallen silent. The pillars are still here. The language that once wrapped around them like smoke is gone. If you step back out of enclosure D in your imagination and turn slightly along the slope of the hill, you don't have to go far to find where those people of stone were born. Roughly 100 metre away, just beyond the crest, the bedrock breaks open into a scarred patch of pale limestone. It doesn't look like much at first glance, just another rocky outcrop on an Anatolian hillside. But if you look closely, the rock isn't random, it's been shaped. Channels have been cut into the stone, rectangles have been outlined and removed. Shallow steps, tool marks, half-formed blocks. The hill itself has been quarried. This is where Pillar 18 and Pillar 31, and dozens of their companions, almost certainly came from. That short distance matters. 100 metres is nothing if you have trucks and cranes. If you have only ropes, levers and your own bodies, it's the difference between possible and impossible. Sourcing stone right next to the site meant you could see, before you ever started moving anything, what you had to work with. You could test a block, read the grain, abandon a flawed piece and start another without having already dragged it for miles. It also tells us something crucial. These pillars were not mysterious imports from a vanished civilization far away. The evidence for their origin is right here, cut into the same hill they stand on. Limestone, thankfully for the builders, is a forgiving rock. It's comparatively soft, especially when freshly exposed. With hard stone hammers, basalt for example, you can bruise it, chip it, and gradually persuade it into the shapes you want. No copper chisels, no iron saws, just stone on stone, thousands upon thousands of controlled impacts. Archaeologists think the process went in stages. First came selection. Someone with experience would walk the exposed bedrock, looking for large, clean slabs, few cracks, no big inclusions, a thickness and length that could yield a future pillar. They weren't just grabbing whatever rock was handy, they were reading the hill. Then came outlining. Workers would peck a groove along the intended edges of the block, tracing the eventual profile like drawing the outline of a figure before colouring it in. Blow by blow, the groove deepened into a trench. At some point, that outline stops being just a rectangle and starts to look suggestively like a capital T. The crossbar of the future pillar had to be there from the start, part of a single continuous stone. So the quarrymen had to imagine, right there in the bedrock, not only the long vertical shaft, but also the horizontal shoulders spreading out at the top. They cut channels around that entire shape, isolating it from the surrounding mass. The next step was undercutting, freeing the stone from below. This is harder to reconstruct in detail, but by working from the sides, expanding the trenches, and exploiting natural bedding planes, they could eventually pry the block loose, perhaps using wooden wedges soaked with water to widen cracks. We know they didn't always finish the job. At Göbekli Tepe's quarry there is an unfinished giant, a pillar roughly the size of the central pair, about 50 tons by modern estimates, still attached to the living rock. Its outline is almost complete. The T-shape is unmistakable. You can trace its edges, walk along its length, and then, at one end, watch it blur back into untouched bedrock. Something stopped the work here. Maybe the stone cracked as they undercut it. Maybe a flaw appeared, an inclusion, a line of weakness that made it unsafe to raise. Maybe they simply decided it was too ambitious, that slightly smaller monoliths were more practical. Whatever the reason, this half-born pillar is a frozen moment in prehistory. The quarry equivalent of a brushstroke left unfinished. It also gives us a rare time slice of the process. You can see the stages, the rough outline, the beginning of smoothing, the places where the surface is still crude, and the stretches where someone has already started to dress the stone, taking down high points, erasing the raw bruises of extraction. Once a block was freed from the bedrock, the work didn't stop. In a way, it only became more delicate. A pillar that long and that heavy is also vulnerable. A single uncontrolled impact can create a hairline fracture that might not show itself until you try to stand the stone upright. So the shaping and smoothing had to be done with a blend of force and restraint. They would have rotated the block, or at least worked around its exposed faces, knocking off bulges, straightening edges, gradually turning a quarried mass into a consistent geometric form. The corners of the shaft are surprisingly true. The faces are broad and planar. Before you can carve fox pelts and belts into a surface, you have to create that surface. This implies planning. The relief carvings at Göbekli Tepe are not improvisations slapped onto whatever rock happened to be available. The builders needed enough flat, continuous area on each face to host animals, symbols, and, in the case of the central pillars, those long, running arms. That means someone had to be thinking ahead at the quarry stage. This face will be the front, this edge will carry the hands, this band around the middle will be where the belt goes. Every decision at the quarry ripples forward into the enclosure. The proximity of the quarry to the circles and the matching tool marks between worked bedrock and finished pillars make one thing clear. This was local work. The same hillside that holds the enclosures also provided their bones. There is no need to imagine colossal stones dragged from distant mountains or flown in by lost technologies. The evidence of extraction, shaping, and abandonment is literally carved into the ground. Which brings us back to the people holding those hammerstones. To read the quarry is to realise how much skill was involved. You don't learn to free a 50-ton block from bedrock on your first try. You don't get clean T-shapes by accident. There must have been specialists here, individuals who knew what a good block looked like, how far you could push a fracture line, where to deepen a groove and where to leave supporting stone in place until the last possible moment. That kind of expertise doesn't appear overnight. It takes practice, and practice takes time. Time for older workers to show younger ones how to swing a hammerstone so it cuts, instead of just smearing the surface. Time to learn which parts of the limestone ring when struck, and which thud with hidden weakness. Time to pass on rules of thumb. Never cut here, always leave a bridge of stone there, always test the sound before you pry. In other words, this quarry is not just a place where rocks were cut. It's a classroom, an apprenticeship ground, a record of invisible years spent turning raw human effort into reliable technique. If you'd like to go deeper into how ancient sites like this were actually built and lived in, there's a book at sleepytimehistory.com that unpacks the stories behind several early monuments, including Göbekli Tepe. It's on discount this week if you're curious to explore more quietly on your own time. For now, hold on to this image. A small group of people on a limestone shelf 100 metres from the enclosures, their days measured in the rhythm of hammerstones and the slow appearance of a T-shape out of the hill. No metal, no beasts of burden. Just knowledge, coordination, and an enormous amount of patience. When we ask how they later moved a 50-ton stone, we're really asking about that same combination of skill and time. The quarry shows us that both were already in place long before any pillar ever stood upright. Walk back down in your mind from the quarry to those sunken circles. You duck again into enclosure D, into the cool of the pit, and let your eyes run over the pillars. At first, it's just stone and shadow. Then, as your attention settles, the animals start to appear. They're everywhere. On one pillar, a boar barrels forward, shoulders rounded, snout thrust out, bristles suggested with a few confident cuts. Its legs are tucked under it in a pose that feels like motion, even though it's frozen in limestone. On another, a fox slips along the edge of the stone, long body stretched, tail flowing behind like a banner. Its head is flattened into a kind of emblematic shape, triangular with a pointed snout and pricked ears. Not a portrait of a specific individual, but the idea of fox reduced to a few essential lines. Between and below them, snakes coil and uncoil. Some are simple curves, others are carved in such high relief that their bodies seem to slide across the pillar's face, ribs and scales hinted at with shallow incisions. A few rear up, heads lifted, as if midway through a strike. Look higher and vultures appear. Broad wings, hooked beaks, necks that bend like question marks. Their bodies are often in profile, but the wings flatten toward you, spread wide. They're rendered with a stylized clarity that makes them easy to recognize, even when weathering has softened the details. There are scorpions too. They crouch at the bases of pillars or lurk under other figures, small compact bodies with fan-shaped pincers and the unmistakable arc of a tail, ready to sting. Even reduced to a few chiselled forms, the posture reads as threat, and looming among them there are aurochs, prehistoric wild cattle, bigger and more dangerous than any modern cow. Massive heads, heavy necks, curved horns. Sometimes they're shown with their backs arched and their heads lowered, the classic pose of a charging bull, the bulk of the animal suggested by deep carving around the outline so the body stands proud of the pillar's face. This is not casual scratching. Technically, Most of these carvings are done in high relief. The figures are not merely drawn on the surface. The stone around them has been cut back so that the animals stand out, casting their own shadows. To achieve that in limestone, you don't just trace a line. You commit to an entire zone of the pillar, carving down and around the shapes you want to keep. The style is strikingly confident. Lines are sure, curves are smooth, proportions are consistent from pillar to pillar. Foxes look like the same kind of fox. Boars look like the same kind of boar. The vultures have a shared design language, as if the carvers were trained in a particular way of representing them. And this is important. The motifs repeat. You find foxes in multiple enclosures, always with that same long-stretched body and emblematic head. You see boars again and again, often at similar heights on the pillars. Snakes recur, sometimes alone, sometimes threading between other animals. Vultures turn up not just once, but as a kind of signature presence in these circles. When archaeologists mapped the imagery, a pattern emerged. Danger dominates. Predators and threatening creatures, foxes, snakes, scorpions, boars that can gore, aurochs that can trample, vastly outweigh obvious prey animals. There are gazelles and other gentler shapes here and there, but they do not set the tone. The emotional temperature of these carvings is not calm pastoral life. It's edge of the hunt, edge of the cliff. Why? We don't know. And at a site this old, we need to sit with that uncertainty. Still, it's hard not to wonder what role these creatures played in the minds of the people who carved them. One possibility is protection. In many later cultures, dangerous animals are carved not because people like looking at them, but because they matter spiritually. Put a threatening creature on the boundary of a sacred space, and it becomes a kind of guardian. The thing you fear is turned outward, watching the threshold. Another possibility is that these are clan animals, totemic emblems of groups and lineages, a fox pillar for a fox clan, a boar pillar for a boar clan. Repeat the same animal in multiple circles, and you might be seeing the same group returning over generations, reasserting its identity in stone. They could also be mythic beings. In a world without writing, stories live in memory and performance, but they can also live in images. A vulture might not just be a scavenger bird. It might be a character in a creation story, or a messenger between the world of the living and the dead. A snake might stand for renewal, danger, underground forces, or something we don't even have words for anymore. And there is the idea of taboo. Sometimes the animals you carve are the ones you don't eat, or can only hunt under strict conditions. Making them prominent, oversized, and repeatedly visible might be a way of marking their special status. These are not just resources, they are beings with rules attached. Whatever the exact meanings, it's clear the stones are doing social work. In non-literate societies, art is not a luxury. It's a memory device, a boundary marker, a way of saying we and not we. When you gather people from scattered bands across the landscape, you need shared narratives to hold them together. You need agreed-upon symbols that carry stories everyone knows, even if they tell them in slightly different ways. A circle of pillars crowded with powerful animals can do that. You don't have to read text to understand that a space ringed with vultures and foxes and charging bulls is not ordinary ground. You feel it. You remember the stories that explain why those creatures are here. You teach those stories to children, pointing up at the same carved forms that your grandparents pointed to. Over time, the pillars become more than stone. They become a stone archive of identity, of myth, of the invisible webs of meaning that tie distant groups into something like a shared culture. But there is another pattern here, just as important as the animals that are present. For all the foxes and boars and snakes, humans are strangely rare. When they do appear, their bodies are odd, abstracted, sometimes distorted, and alongside them there are symbols that are not animals at all, H-shapes, crescents, nets of lines. If the animals are the loud, obvious part of the message, these human and abstract figures are the whisper underneath. To read Göbekli Tepe, we have to look at both. So after walking among the predators in stone, it's time to turn to the scarcer, stranger images, the rare human figures, their unusual bodies, and the symbols that surround them. If you start looking for people on these pillars, you notice something unsettling. They're mostly not there. Animals crowd the stone, layered, overlapping, repeated. Humans, by contrast, are rare, and when they do appear, they're often partial, distorted, or doing things that make us pause. On a few pillars, there are what archaeologists call anthropomorphic beings, human-like forms, but they aren't cozy, everyday scenes. No one is grinding grain or cradling a child. There are no faces you could recognize, no hands reaching out in familiar gestures. Instead, you get torsos without heads, legs without upper bodies, arms that seem to sprout from nowhere. And every so often something stranger still, a headless ithyphallic figure, a clearly male body, the genitals exaggerated but the head either missing or never carved at all. To modernize those images can be jarring. They invite sensationalism. It's easy to project lurid or simplistic stories onto them. But if we slow down, the first thing to notice isn't the sexuality. It's the absence. Why, in a place where vultures and snakes are rendered with such care, are human heads so often missing? Why does the part of the body we instinctively focus on, the face, the seat of identity in many cultures, disappear from the stone? One line of thought, widely discussed but still debated, connects these images to mortuary practice. In later Neolithic sites across the Near East, we see a pattern. People bury their dead under house floors. Then, after some time, they reopen the graves, remove the skulls, and treat them separately, plaster them, paint them, even model faces over the bone. Göbekli Tepe is thousands of years earlier, and we should be careful not to simply read later customs backward. But we do know that human bones at the site show cut marks consistent with defleshing. We know skull fragments were found in contexts that suggest they may have been curated or displayed, and here, in the imagery, we see headless bodies frozen in stone. It is at least plausible that headlessness meant something specific to the people who carved these pillars. Perhaps the removal of the head was part of a transition from ordinary person to ancestor. Perhaps the head, once taken, belonged to another realm of ritual we can no longer see. The ithyphallic aspect may tie into this rather than being a separate theme. In many later traditions, heightened sexuality and death belong together in myth and ritual. Fertility, danger, the crossing of thresholds. A headless, aroused male figure might not be about sex in a modern sense at all. It could signal potency redirected, life force turned toward the ancestors or toward some otherworldly transformation. Or, alternatively, it could be part of an initiation narrative. There is a long ethnographic record of societies using provocative, shocking, or taboo-breaking imagery in rites of passage, especially those that separate children from adults. If Göbekli Tepe was a place where young people were brought into new social roles, confronting ambiguous, unsettling images of the human body could have been part of that process. A symbolic taking of the head to mark the leaving behind of childhood. These are possibilities, not certainties. The truth is, we don't know exactly what those headless ithyphallic figures meant. What we can say is that they were prominent enough and repeated enough to be part of the site's iconographic vocabulary. They mattered. Around and between those rare human forms, another layer of imagery appears, abstract signs. One of the most persistent of these is the so-called H symbol, two parallel vertical lines crossed by one or more short horizontals. Sometimes the horizontals are centered, making a perfect capital H. Sometimes they sit higher or lower, or there are multiple bars turning the sign into a kind of ladder or gate. These H shapes recur across multiple pillars and enclosures. They appear near animals, near human-like figures, sometimes on their own. They are not random scratches. They are deliberate marks carved with the same confident hand that gave us the foxes and vultures. What do they mean? Here again, interpretation is speculative. Some researchers have suggested they might represent a stylized human form, 2 legs with a connecting torso. Others think they could be schematic huts or enclosures, viewed from above. A few have proposed more abstract possibilities, a symbol for connection, for between, for the joining of 2 realms. And of course there are more imaginative readings, claims that the H stands for constellations or for some lost script, or for visitors from elsewhere. Those ideas tend to outrun the evidence. From a cautious perspective, we can at least say this. At a site that seems to function as a gathering point for scattered groups, a sign built from 2 uprights and a connector might speak of boundaries joined, separations bridged. It might mark passages, agreements, or shared spaces. It might trace, in bare geometry, some of the same social work the circles themselves are doing in stone. The H symbols are not alone. There are crescents, stacked lines, ladder-like patterns, and dense meshes of crossing grooves that look almost like nets. On some pillars, these geometric motifs interact with animals or human forms, framing them or cutting across them as if they belong to the same story. One interpretive frame sees these abstract patterns as parts of a ritual narrative. The animals, the rare humans, the headless bodies, the H signs and nets. They could be episodes or elements in mythic cycles retold during ceremonies. When people gathered here, elders might have moved from pillar to pillar, tracing lines in the air, telling how the fox clan crossed the boundary, how the vulture took the head, how the first ancestors passed through the gate into a different world. Another frame emphasizes social boundaries. A circle of pillars is a physical enclosure. The images on those pillars could be a map of who belongs inside, under what conditions, certain animals standing for particular lineages, certain abstract signs marking alliances or prohibitions, human figures signalling the status of those who have been initiated versus those who have not. And then there is mortuary symbolism. If Göbekli Tepe was used, even occasionally for rituals around the dead, the imagery might encode beliefs about what happens at death, the removal of the head, the role of vultures as cleaners of the bones, the crossing of thresholds marked by H gates or net-like veils. The abstract signs could be as much about invisible journeys as about visible social rules. But for all these possibilities, there are strict limits to what iconography alone can tell us. A carved vulture does not automatically mean a sky god. A headless body does not automatically mean decapitation in life. An H symbol carved on 2 pillars does not prove a written script. Without accompanying texts, without direct ethnographic continuity, we're always working backward from image to meaning, and that path is narrow. Archaeologists try to constrain their interpretations by looking for patterns. Which images appear together, at what heights, in what parts of enclosures, in association with which bones or artifacts. They compare Göbekli Tepe to slightly later sites to see how motifs evolve. They test ideas against the distribution of finds, against microscopic wear on stone, against residues and radiocarbon dates. Even then, most conclusions are framed in careful language, may indicate, is consistent with, could suggest. The temptation is always to tell a smooth story. The reality is a cloud of probabilities. So as you imagine these rare human figures, headless bodies, rigid torsos, exaggerated genitals, standing among crowds of predators and guardians, it's worth holding 2 thoughts at once. First, this was not random decoration. These choices meant something deep to the people who made them, something tied to their rituals, their social bonds, their ideas of life and death. Second, we may never know exactly what that meaning was. We can approach it, sketch the outlines of possible stories, but the precise lines of the narrative are gone, and there's a strange kind of beauty in that gap. If you enjoy lingering in that space between evidence and mystery, by the way, there's a longer book-length journey through deep time and early civilizations waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com. There's a discount running this week if you'd like to explore these worlds in more detail. Here, though, we'll stay on the hill with the clues we do have. Because among all the human and abstract images, one pillar in particular has drawn more attention than any other. Its surface is crowded with animals and symbols, arranged in bands from top to bottom, as if it's telling a compressed vertical story. Some see on it the sky itself written in a stone. That pillar is number 43, and stepping closer to it takes us into one of the most heated debates about Göbekli Tepe, whether these people were just carving what they saw around them, or whether they were already watching the stars. Pillar 43 stands toward the edge of one of the main enclosures, but once you notice it, it's hard to look anywhere else. Archaeologists often call it the vulture stone, not because there's only one bird on it, but because a particular vulture dominates the composition. Wings spread, legs outstretched, as if hovering or descending. Around it, and stacked above and below it, is a dense cascade of other figures. If you could run your fingers gently down the stone, you'd pass through several horizontal bands of imagery. At the top, there's a kind of box or rectangular symbol, sometimes described as a belt or an abstract object. Below that, a row of animals, a crane-like bird, that big vulture, a scorpion with its tail curved up, smaller shapes that look like a quadruped, perhaps a dog or a fox. Further down, there's another vulture, this one with its wings raised and its body angled, and beside it something that looks, at least to modern eyes, like a human form. The body is small, simplified, with no detailed head. Overlapping and flanking all of this are more abstract motifs, circles, hooked lines, and a series of what look like vertical C-shapes lined up in a row. It feels ordered, but not in any obvious way. Not a scene like a comic strip, not a single animal dominating the field like a heraldic emblem. Instead, it's layered and compressed, a whole cluster of signs running from the top of the pillar almost to the bottom. From the very beginning of the excavations, this pillar pulled people in. It looks intentional. It looks like it's trying to say something specific. The question is, what? One family of interpretations, which has become very popular in books and documentaries, suggests that Pillar 43 is not just a collection of animals, but a kind of story or calendar. According to this view, the animals are not only creatures from the local landscape, they're also stand-ins for constellations. We know that many later cultures mapped animals onto the night sky. The Greeks gave us Scorpius the scorpion and Aquila the eagle. In Mesopotamia and beyond, birds and quadrupeds and hybrid beings marched across the heavens in stories and star lists. If you already have that pattern in mind, it's tempting to look at the combination of a large vulture-like bird, a scorpion, other recognizable animals on Pillar 43 and think, this is a sky map. In 2017, two researchers, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, pushed that idea much further. They argued that the animals on Pillar 43 can be systematically matched to specific constellations as they would have appeared around 10,950 BC. In their reading, the central vulture corresponds to Sagittarius, the scorpion corresponds to Scorpius, and the arrangement of figures encodes the position of the sky at a particular moment in time. That moment, in their argument, is not random. They link it to the onset of the Younger Dryas, the abrupt cooling event that began roughly 12,900 years ago, long before Göbekli Tepe was built but still within the memory of deep tradition. Sweatman and Tsikritsis suggest that the pillar records, in symbolic form, a comet impact associated with that climate shift, a sort of cosmic disaster tale carved into stone thousands of years after the fact. In their model, the top box symbol might even represent a shattered object in the sky, or a marker for the position of the sun at the time of the impact. The human-like figure near the vulture becomes not just a person but a victim. The whole pillar becomes an encoded warning or memorial, a story of fire from the sky, preserved as a timeless sky chart. It's a bold and dramatic proposal. It also sits on the edge between hypothesis and speculation, and most specialists in Near Eastern prehistory treat it with considerable caution. There are a few reasons for that. First, the basic step from animal on a pillar to constellation in the sky is not trivial. Yes, many societies have seen patterns among the stars. Yes, some have projected familiar animals upward. But the exact mapping, this bird to that cluster of stars, this scorpion to that one, is culturally specific. We can't assume that what looks to us like Scorpius would have meant scorpion to people at Göbekli Tepe. We're importing much later star lore backward in time. Second, the matching process itself can be very forgiving. If you start with a desired date and a target event, the Younger Dryas, and go hunting for constellations that fit a pre-chosen narrative, it becomes easy to slide into pattern matching. You adjust which animal corresponds to which constellation, rotate things a bit, stretch the time window, and eventually you get a configuration that seems to line up. From a statistical standpoint, that's dangerous. Almost any moderately complex set of symbols can be retrofitted to some arrangement of stars if you're allowed to choose your mapping after the fact. Archaeologists refer to this as the risk of over-interpretation, seeing coherent codes where there may just be overlapping motifs. Third, there's the problem of context and dating. Pillar 43 belongs to one particular enclosure. It was set up, used, and eventually buried within a certain phase of the site's life, around 9,600 BC, give or take a few centuries. The Younger Dryas onset is more than 3,000 years earlier. It's not impossible for oral traditions to preserve memories, real or mythologized, across that span. But it does add another step of assumption. Not only were they mapping the sky, they were preserving a highly specific date from long before, and so far, Pillar 43 is relatively unique in its dense banded composition. If Göbekli Tepe were full of similar date stones clearly key to sky events, that would strengthen the astronomical case. Instead, we have one visually striking outlier and a handful of other pillars that might or might not echo its themes. That doesn't mean the people here ignored the sky. There's a growing curiosity in both academic and popular circles about the Younger Dryas, climate swings, and the possibility that ancient peoples responded to dramatic environmental events with rituals and stories. It would be surprising if a community this organized, this symbolically rich, never looked up, never wove stars into their myth world. But at present the specific claim that Pillar 43 encodes a precise date for a comet impact remains debated. It's a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. There are alternative readings. Some scholars see the vulture and the scorpion and the abstract signs as part of a terrestrial ritual sequence, perhaps related to death and excarnation, perhaps to territorial spirits or clan emblems. In that view, the bands might separate different layers of a mythic landscape, sky above, earth in the middle, underworld below, without requiring exact astronomical correspondences. Others emphasize continuity with later Near Eastern iconography, where vultures often appear in connection with warfare, kingship, or the handling of the dead. The small human-like figure near the vulture on Pillar 43 in this frame could be a soul, an initiate, or a symbolic victim being transported, not a person literally falling from the heavens. Still others focus less on decoding and more on structure. They note that Pillar 43 faces inward toward the circle, that its images are placed at heights corresponding to where human eyes and hands would naturally fall, and that similar animals recur across other pillars in the same enclosure. From this angle, the pillar might be part of a choreographed performance space. Its meaning would be activated by movement and speech, by stories we no longer have, rather than by a fixed star chart. Where does that leave us? With something both solid and elusive. The carvings are real. The vulture, the scorpion, the stacked bands of symbols, they're not accidents. They took time, skill, and intent. Pillar 43 clearly meant something powerful to the people who gathered around it. Powerful enough to justify the effort of hauling and shaping that stone. Powerful enough to stand at the heart of their ritual architecture. Whether that power came from remembered disaster in the sky, from journeys of the soul, from clan histories, or from stories that don't fit neatly into any of our categories, we can't yet say. What we can do is treat the stone with the same kind of respect its makers did, paying attention to its details, acknowledging the pull it exerts on our imaginations, and being honest about where interpretation shades into guesswork. And as we step away from Pillar 43, that honesty will matter even more, because just a few meters away another stone is waiting, covered not in birds and scorpions, but in something that looks, uncannily, like a net filled with snakes. Pillar 33 stands a little more quietly than the vulture stone, but when you get close, it's overwhelming in a different way. Instead of a few large dominating figures, its surface is crowded, almost claustrophobic. The central motif that archaeologists keep coming back to is a dense field of snakes, their bodies overlapping and crossing in such a way that people often describe it as a net or a lattice, woven entirely out of serpents. The snakes aren't coiled in circles or striking dramatically with open jaws. Most of them are rendered in that same spare, economical style you see elsewhere at Göbekli Tepe. Long, slightly tapering bodies, simple heads, no unnecessary detail. They run mostly vertically, side by side, sometimes crossing. The effect is less like a single animal and more like a texture, like the surface of the pillar itself has become a living mesh. If you imagine standing in that enclosure, with a circular wall around you and these T-shaped stones rising up, Pillar 33 would have had a particular presence. You might not immediately pick out individual snakes. Instead, you'd register density, multiplicity, a surface so busy with lines that your eyes almost buzz trying to follow them. Snakes show up all over Göbekli Tepe. They're carved on other pillars, on small stone plaquettes, even occasionally on the walls. They're one of the most frequently repeated animals on the site. When a motif keeps coming back in different places and different contexts, archaeologists start to suspect it isn't just decoration, it's probably part of a shared symbolic language. But what that language was saying is the hard part. We know snakes are powerful symbols in many later cultures. They can stand for danger because they bite, and many are venomous. They can stand for transformation because they shed their skins. In some traditions they mark boundaries between life and death, inside and outside, the safe village and the wild beyond. In others, they're tied to water and fertility, appearing near springs, rivers, or underworld streams. It's tempting to reach for those later meanings and apply them here. Maybe the people at Göbekli Tepe feared snakes, respected them, or saw them as guardians of something. Maybe this pillar marked a threshold in the ritual space, a symbolic barrier you had to pass. But we have to be careful not to let familiarity become an excuse for certainty. Instead of jumping straight to what does one snake mean, researchers at Göbekli Tepe look at patterns. Where do snakes appear together? Which animals are they paired with? Do they tend to cluster in certain enclosures and not others? That's where Pillar 33 gets particularly interesting. The net of snakes on this stone doesn't stand alone. Similar snake-heavy compositions appear in a limited set of enclosures. Other circles, by contrast, lean more heavily on foxes or boars or birds. It begins to look as if each enclosure might have had its own motif cluster, its own internal theme. One circle, dominated by foxes, might have centred around stories, identities, or rituals involving that animal. Another, like the one with Pillar 33, seems saturated with snakes. That doesn't tell us the content of the stories, but it hints at structure. Different groups, or different ceremonial roles, may have gathered around different circles, each with its own visual signature. So the snakes are probably doing several things at once. On a practical, everyday level, people in this landscape lived with real snakes. In the grass, among the rocks, near water sources. They were a genuine hazard. Learning where they appeared and how to avoid them would have been a basic survival skill. Carving them again and again, threading them across a pillar, might have reinforced that awareness, or encoded taboos and instructions in a memorable form. On a psychological level, snakes are perfect carriers of big feelings: fear, fascination, unease, respect. They move silently. They appear and vanish. They blur the line between above and below, surface and hidden. If you're trying to give shape to forces that feel dangerous but also necessary, rain, fertility, the turning of seasons, the unseen world of spirits, snakes are ready-made symbols. Some scholars have suggested that in this region, where seasonal rains can transform a dry valley overnight, snakes might have been linked to water, emerging from holes and cracks when the soil softens, appearing near fresh pools. Others have pointed to their boundary-crossing nature and wondered if they mark transitions in ritual, the moment when you left ordinary space and entered the charged interior of the circle. These are possibilities, not proven readings. We don't have inscriptions. We don't have myths written down in a language we can decode. All we have are stones, bones, soil, and the patterns that emerge when you look at them carefully. So interpretations get tested, not by asking, does this idea sound poetic, but by asking, does it fit the wider context? If snakes are about water, do they tend to occur near features that might involve liquids, basins, channels, particular floor installations? If they're guardians of thresholds, do they cluster on pillars near entrances or liminal points? If different enclosures have different animal themes, do other aspects of those circles, offerings, architectural tweaks, wear patterns on the floor, line up with that division? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's a frustrating maybe. Sometimes a neat theory falls apart as soon as more data comes in from the next season of excavation. Still, even in our uncertainty, Pillar 33 tells us something undeniable. Whoever carved it was willing to invest an enormous amount of time and focus into covering that surface with snakes. Whoever organised the work here decided that this dense, almost suffocating mesh of serpents was worth the effort of cutting, moving, and erecting a massive limestone monolith, then carefully incising it with tool blows that add up to a pattern you can feel with your fingertips. If the vulture stone invites us to think about the sky, Pillar 33 pulls us back down to the ground, to the crawling, writhing, dangerous life at our feet, and to the invisible webs of meaning that a community can spin around a single class of animal. And when you step back and look at it in the broader sweep of the site, one thing becomes harder and harder to ignore. None of this, neither the imagery nor the stones themselves, would exist without a staggering amount of labour. Carving dozens of snakes into a pillar is one kind of commitment. Getting that pillar into place in the first place is another story entirely. To understand just how extreme that commitment was, we have to look away from the carvings for a moment and focus on the raw mass of the stones themselves, on what it meant in 9600 BC to move a single block that weighed as much as a fully loaded truck. Let's take one of those great central pillars and think about it not as an artwork but as a physics problem. The biggest stones at Göbekli Tepe are in the range of 10 to maybe 20 tons. Some unfinished blocks in the quarry area might have reached 40 or 50 tons if they'd ever been freed and moved. Even if we stay conservative and imagine a block of, say, 15 tons, we're still talking about a single piece of limestone that weighs as much as a loaded semi-truck. Now imagine that truck has no wheels, just you, your friends, and a bare stone sitting partway up a rocky hill. The first issue is simple mass. To even budge something like that, you have to overcome static friction, the tendency of heavy objects to sit there and ignore you. Experiments with similar stones suggest that with a reasonably smooth surface under the block and good wooden sledges, you might get away with something like 20 to 40 people pulling a 10-ton stone on level ground. But Göbekli Tepe isn't on level ground, it's on a ridge, with slopes, uneven surfaces, and patches of loose rock and soil. There are no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheels, no pulleys. Archaeologists and engineers who model this kind of work usually talk in ranges because there are so many unknowns. How polished were the sled runners? How well packed was the path? Did they lubricate it with water, mud, or animal fat? Were they pulling uphill, downhill, or along a contour? Under decent conditions, good sled, compacted path, slight slope, you might move a 10 to 15-ton block with, say, 40 to 80 people hauling, and another dozen or two handling levers and stabilizing ropes. Push that up toward 30 or 40 tons, and suddenly you're in the territory of 150, 200, maybe more, depending on how cautious you want to be. And caution matters. If a 30-ton monolith slips sideways on a hill, there's not much you can do except get out of the way and hope nobody's crushed. That's why most plausible reconstructions of Göbekli Tepe's construction start with the same basic toolkit: sledges, rollers, levers, ropes, and ramps. You can picture the sequence. First, somebody cuts a trench around the outline of the pillar in the bedrock, then undercuts it until the block lies free on a kind of stone pedestal. Wooden levers, simple pry bars, start to wobble it, just enough to work thick beams or sled runners underneath. Next comes the path. You don't drag a raw stone over jagged ground if you can help it. You build the road first. Packed earth ramps, perhaps faced with smaller stones, logs laid crosswise as rollers in some stretches, or a continuous wooden sled track. The path doesn't have to be long. Some quarries are only tens of meters from their final circles, but every meter matters when your cargo could kill someone if it tips. Ropes of twisted plant fibers or animal hide get lashed around the pillar or its sled. People line up, in front to pull, at the sides with guide ropes, at the back with levers to nudge and pivot. Someone, maybe several someones, has to be calling the rhythm, giving signals, deciding when to stop, when to rest, when to try that awkward turn. A little water, wet clay, or animal fat spread on the path can cut friction dramatically. That sounds almost trivial, but in real experiments it can halve the pulling force you need. Suddenly 80 people can do what would otherwise have taken 150. All of this is within the reach of Stone Age technology. No supernatural machinery required. No lost industrial civilization. Just patient engineering and a very clear sense of what a log, a rope, and a slope can do when you combine them properly. But even if the methods are simple, the numbers pose a different sort of puzzle. A typical hunter-gatherer band in many ethnographic studies sits somewhere around 20 to 50 people. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. That's the scale of a group that can move together, make decisions, share food, and not tear itself apart under normal conditions. To get 100, 200, or more adults together in one place for coordinated heavy labour, you need aggregation. Multiple bands converging at the same time. Seasonal gatherings like this are actually well documented in hunter-gatherer societies. People come together when a particular resource peaks. A salmon run, a mass migration of caribou, the ripening of a specific plant. For a few weeks, the population of a valley can swell far beyond what it supports the rest of the year. Göbekli Tepe might be exactly that kind of place, a ritual and feasting centre where groups who normally ranged across separate territories came together, bringing meat, hides, tools and labour. In that context, the labour problem becomes tricky, but not impossible. If several bands, each of 30 or 40 people, arrive at a hilltop once or twice a year, it's suddenly plausible to line up 100 strong backs in front of a sledge. You can imagine the job being done in bursts, a few days of intense hauling each season, gradually raising and arranging the circle over years. But this raises another question. If you're spending that much energy on stones and carvings, someone has to be thinking about food. Even without farming, you still have to provision an oversized camp. That means planning hunts so there's meat when the gathering happens, smoking and drying surplus ahead of time, maybe storing nuts, seeds, or wild grains in pits. It might mean that some individuals or some families specialize a bit more in gathering, in butchering, in brewing or cooking, so others can focus on quarrying and carving. Leadership and organization start to matter in a new way. Someone has to coordinate to say, we'll meet at the hill after the gazelle migration, or this year we're going to finish that second pillar. Someone has to mediate disputes when bands with different traditions and territories share one sacred place. Someone has to persuade people that instead of spending every spare hour improving their own shelters and tools, they should haul another stone up the slope for a circle they'll only visit occasionally. You don't need kings or priests in robes to do that. A few respected elders, skilled storytellers, successful hunters, or charismatic ritual specialists could be enough. But whatever the exact arrangement, the social fabric has to be strong. Because none of this is a one-off stunt. The quarry scars and layered enclosures at Göbekli Tepe tell us this wasn't a single building season. It was a project maintained and renewed over generations. So we end up with a deeper puzzle, layered underneath the physics and the engineering. Not how do you move a 50-ton stone. We can sketch out reasonable answers to that with logs and ramps and ropes. The more unsettling question is, why do you convince people to move a 50-ton stone not once but again and again? What story, what shared belief, what emotional charge makes that effort feel not like a burden, but like a necessary act? To get closer to that, we have to look not just at how these people moved, but how they gathered, how rituals, feasts and shared symbols might have come first, and how the world of Göbekli Tepe could have pulled scattered groups into something new. Klaus Schmidt's answer to that deeper puzzle was bold enough to make a lot of archaeologists uncomfortable. He looked at this barren limestone ridge, at its oversized pillars and animal swarms and carefully backfilled enclosures, and suggested something that flipped an old story upside down. For decades, the standard picture went like this. First people settle down, then they farm, then surplus food support specialists, and only after that do you get big public buildings and elaborate temples. Villages build belief, granaries pay for priests. Schmidt walked up that hill and said, maybe not. Maybe, in this corner of the world at least, it went the other way around. Temple first, farm second. In his view, places like Göbekli Tepe weren't side effects of agriculture. They were engines that helped create it. Imagine how this might work in practice. Once or twice a year, scattered bands converge on the hilltop. They bring meat from gazelle and aurochs hunts, maybe baskets of gathered fruits and nuts, skins of fermented drink made from wild plants or honey, fires, noise, stories, and whatever rituals those T-shaped stones demanded. If that kind of gathering becomes a tradition, predictability starts to matter. You don't want to show up to the great feast with empty hands. You don't want a drought or a bad hunting season to make the ritual impossible, so you start to hedge against uncertainty. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe is even today friendly to certain plants. Wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, several species of wild pulses. Long before anyone built stone houses or ploughed fields, people here would have known those plants intimately, where they grew, when they ripened, how they responded to rain or lack of it. Now add the pressure of regular, large gatherings. You know that, say, in late spring or early summer, people will be up on that hill, expecting meat and maybe something bready or porridge-like to go with it. If you want to be sure there's grain to grind, you can't just hope the wild stands happen to do well. You start doing little things. You harvest more systematically, maybe a bit earlier, to beat the birds and rodents. You collect the fattest, fullest heads of grain, and instead of eating every last one, you accidentally or deliberately drop some near camp or in a favoured patch of soil. You clear away competing shrubs from a good stand. You burn last year's stubble to encourage new growth. None of that is full agriculture. It's not ploughs and farmsteads and fenced fields. It's small nudges, early management of wild cereals, but those nudges have consequences. Grain that's harvested by hand and transported in baskets tends to favour plants whose seeds don't all shatter and fall to the ground on their own. Over generations, people repeatedly selecting and resowing those seeds end up with populations that look more and more domesticated. Bigger grains, tougher stalks, more synchronous ripening. From the outside, it looks like a gradual slide. From intensive gathering to low-level tending to something we'd recognise as cultivation. In Schmidt's framework, the big ritual centre is the driver of that intensification. If the feast on the hill is the social and spiritual heart of your year, if your group status depends on how much food you can lay out, if certain offerings of bread or beer or porridge become part of the ceremony, then managing wild cereals stops being an optional side activity and starts becoming a duty. The temple demands grain, and so you learn to make grain more reliable. Some researchers have taken that further, suggesting that early brewing, fermenting wild grains into beer-like drinks for ritual use, could have been one of the strongest incentives to keep cereal plots going. Beer instead of bread as the original motive for farming. It's an appealing idea, though still speculative. Either way, Schmidt's basic claim was clear. Large, fixed ritual spaces could come before permanent villages and fields. They could be the magnet that pulled people back to the same place again and again, slowly turning a ritual landscape into an economic one. Not everyone agrees. Many archaeologists now prefer to see a more tangled co-evolutionary process. In that view, there isn't a neat sequence where step 1 is temple, step 2 is village, step 3 is field. Instead, you have mobile groups experimenting with semi-permanent camps in especially rich areas. They start storing food in pits. They return seasonally to the same spots. Structures get a bit more solid, a bit more elaborate. Rituals coalesce around particular locations, while practical concerns, water, nearby game, plant resources, quietly shape which locations thrive. Ritual and subsistence and settlement are all changing together, each nudging the others forward. From this angle, Göbekli Tepe might be one dramatic node in a much larger web of change, not a lone temple standing before everything else, but part of a broader shift in how people thought about places, seasons and obligations. What everyone does agree on is timing. However we interpret its function, Göbekli Tepe is early. Very early. We're comfortably in the pre-pottery Neolithic, before ceramics, before clear evidence of domesticated animals in this region, before the full suite of settled farming villages we see a bit later in places like the Upper Tigris and Euphrates valleys. In the centuries after Göbekli Tepe's main phase, this wider region starts to produce some of the earliest solid evidence for domesticated cereals and managed herds. Sites not so far away show corn and barley with domestication traits, sheep and goats under more direct human control, more permanent architecture. Is that a coincidence of geography? The same hills that were good for wild wheat also being good for early farming? Or is there a chain of cause and effect that runs through the great stone circles on the hill? Those are the questions that keep this place fascinating. Did belief build the village, carving its demands into limestone and forcing people to invent new ways to feed a growing ritual calendar? Or did slowly stabilizing camps and early serial plots create the spare time, the surplus, and the social complexity that let people dream up a sanctuary of animal pillars and buried enclosures? We don't have a final answer. We have patterns in charred seeds, wear on grinding stones, the layout of enclosures, and comparisons to younger sites. We have Schmidt's daring proposal and the more cautious models of his colleagues. And we have this stubborn hill, older than pottery, older than any known farm, insisting that whatever the sequence was, it wasn't simple. If you'd like to wander further into that world, into the long, strange transition from roaming bands to settled fields, I go much deeper into these early Neolithic experiments in my book at sleepytimehistory.com, which happens to be discounted this week. For now, though, we'll stay with the stones. Because at some point, after centuries of gatherings and carvings and quiet experiments with plants and animals, something just as strange happened on that ridge. The people who built Göbekli Tepe began to bury it. Archaeologists can see that shift in the dirt. When they peel back Göbekli Tepe's history, they don't just find one moment frozen in stone, they find layers, phases, different ways of using the same hill. The oldest, deepest monumental phase is what we've been talking about so far, what's usually called Layer 3. Those are the big showy enclosures, massive T-shapes, some over 5 meters tall, broad stone circles you could walk into and feel small, a stage set for gatherings on a scale that's hard to picture without cities but clearly didn't need them. Above that, though, is something different. Archaeologists call it Layer 2. It's younger, closer to our time, but still deep in the pre-pottery Neolithic, and when you move into that layer the mood shifts. The pillars are still there, the T-shapes don't disappear, but they shrink. Instead of towering monoliths in broad circular courts, you get smaller uprights, often under 2 meters tall, worked with less ambition. The architecture around them changes too. The big open enclosures give way to tighter stone rooms, low curving walls, spaces that feel more like compartments than theatres. You can imagine walking through this later phase very differently. Instead of descending into a huge echoing circle, dominated by 2 giant central pillars, you thread your way between shorter walls. You pass narrow thresholds, maybe duck under low doorways. You enter rooms that might only hold a handful of people at a time. It's as if the site's monumental voice has grown quieter. What does that mean? One possibility is scale. Layer 3 looks like it could accommodate large periodic gatherings, dozens of people at least, maybe many more, converging for rare, intense events. Layer 2, with its smaller installations, suggests more routine, smaller group activity. Perhaps the rituals that once demanded mass participation were being broken up, localized, folded into the everyday life of smaller communities. Another possibility is social change. Over the centuries, people in this region seem to have been edging toward more settled lives. Not permanent towns everywhere, but more fixed camps, longer occupations, heavier architecture. The wider northern Mesopotamian landscape starts to show houses with stone foundations, storage bins, arranged neighborhoods. If your community is now living most of the year in or near a particular spot, you no longer need one giant, spectacular place that draws everyone from a huge radius all at once. You might instead build a network of smaller sacred spaces, closer to home, easier to maintain, used more frequently by tighter social units. Layer 2 at Göbekli Tepe could be part of that shift. The pillars here often still carry carvings, foxes, snakes, abstract symbols. But the art is generally less exuberant, less deeply cut than on the huge beasts of the older enclosures. Some of the motifs repeat in simplified form, like memories of an earlier visual language being passed down and abbreviated. That's one of the most important clues: continuity. The T-shape itself, that stylized human form with arms and belt and hands, doesn't vanish. It's still there, even when the stones are smaller, even when the architecture tightens. The same basic idea, that these pillars are not just posts but beings, presences, seems to persist. If an entirely new population had swept in and taken over, you might expect more radical change. Different symbols, different building logic. Instead, we see a thinning and rearranging of an existing tradition. It feels less like replacement, more like inheritance under new conditions. Imagine a community whose grandparents built those enormous rings. They grew up hearing stories about the old ceremonies, about nights when the hill blazed with firelight and people arrived from far beyond the horizon. But their own lives are different. They may have more regular access to grain, more reliance on specific plant patches they help manage. Their camps may be spending more months in one place. Obligations and alliances could be settling into new shapes. The great convening on the hill might still matter, but its role could be changing, from the centre of everything to one powerful node in a growing web of villages and ritual spots. Layer 2 can be read as an architectural echo of that transformation. Quieter stones for groups that no longer need or no longer can support. The extravagance of 5-metre pillars. Low walls marking out spaces where ritual is still important, but woven more tightly into everyday settlement patterns. The sacred scaled down without being abandoned. Across the region, we see parallel signs of adjustment. A bit later, at younger sites, houses cluster more firmly. Storage becomes more elaborate. Domesticated cereals and animals start to appear in ways that are hard to ignore. The rhythms of life are slowing, solidifying. Göbekli Tepe's later phase sits in the middle of that process. It's still not a village in the classic sense, no neat grid of houses marching across the ridge, but it doesn't feel as purely episodic and extraordinary as the earliest giant circles. It reads more like a ritual quarter in a landscape where people are beginning to think of particular places as permanent, and that in turn sets up a deeper question. If Layer 2 shows us a gentler, reduced, almost domesticated version of the original vision, if the stones get smaller, the spaces more constrained, the gatherings perhaps more local, what comes next? At some point, building slows. New enclosures are no longer cut from the bedrock. Maintenance gives way to modification, then to neglect. The people who still come here start doing something very deliberate with the old rings and their guardians. They begin to fill them in. Layer 2 is the bridge between the age when Göbekli Tepe was reaching for the sky with colossal human-shaped pillars, and the age when those same pillars would disappear beneath tons of carefully placed rubble. Understanding that quieter, later phase helps us see that the end was probably not sudden. It wasn't a dramatic abandonment in a single season. It looks more like a long fade, shrinking stones, shifting rituals, and then, finally, the decision that the best way to honour this place was not to keep adding to it, but to bury it. In the next section, we'll walk into that endgame and look closely at how you intentionally make a mountain of stone forget its own monuments. When archaeologists first realised what had happened next, it felt almost backwards. You expect an ancient site to be buried by accident, by wind-blown dust, landslides, collapsing roofs, the slow creep of soil. You don't expect the people who built it to be the ones who put it underground. But at Göbekli Tepe, that's what the dirt is saying. Those great stone circles, those T-shaped beings we've been following, did not simply crumble and vanish under natural sediments over thousands of years. They were entombed, deliberately. Imagine standing in one of the big Layer 3 enclosures toward the end of its life. The pillars are already old. The carvings are weather-softened in places. Maybe some walls have been patched, some stones replaced. You step down into the ring as generations before you have done. And then, one day, or more realistically, one season, one decade, the work changes. Stone stops coming out of the hill and starts going back in. The fill that eventually covers these circles is not random hillside collapse. It's a dense mix of broken limestone, small stones, chunks of older architecture, and a huge quantity of animal bones and chipped flint. It's as if someone took apart parts of the wider landscape, camp debris, butchered remains, fragments of other buildings, and used all of it as packing material. In places you can still see the layering, coarse rubble, then finer stones. Pockets where material seems sorted by size, almost like someone was trying to minimize empty space. The gaps between pillars and enclosure walls are stuffed tight, as though the goal was to stabilize and support, not just to drown everything in random trash. That's one of the first clues that this wasn't just a long, slow silting up. If you let wind and rain do the job, you get loose, airy deposits. Clear signs of surfaces forming, erosion cutting in, plant roots wandering through. At Göbekli Tepe the burial layers are compact, heavy, pressed in like insulation. The contacts between layers suggest repeated intentional dumping, not centuries of quiet dust. Another clue is the speed. Archaeologists can estimate how long an enclosure stood open between use and burial by looking for signs of weathering and soil development. Long pauses leave fingerprints, thick carbonate crusts, deep root systems, collapsed walls eroding slowly in place. What we see instead is surprisingly brief. There are episodes of use, then episodes of backfilling, then sometimes renewed building on top. Not 1,000 years of wind slowly filling a ring, but active phases of closing a space, and then reusing the hill. The big Layer 3 circles especially seem to go from functioning architecture to buried architecture on timescales that imply coordinated effort. And the composition of the fill tells its own story. It's full of artifacts from daily life, tools, flakes from tool-making, food refuse, bones from gazelle, wild cattle, wild sheep and goats. In other words, the material you'd expect in middens, the trash heaps of hunter-gatherer camps. But here it isn't lying in mounds on the surface. It's been shoveled, carried, poured into the monumental enclosures as they're being closed. One way to picture this is as recycling. The hill becomes a kind of repository for the traces of many gatherings. Every time people come, hunt, butcher, carve, they create debris. At some point, instead of letting it scatter, they start feeding it back into the very structures that focused those gatherings. To many archaeologists, that pattern, careful packing, sorted material, rapid, deliberate dumping, adds up to a clear conclusion. This is intentional backfilling. Not a clean-up accident, but an act. Which immediately raises the uncomfortable question, why? Why spend generations quarrying, hauling, carving, arranging 50-ton stones into grand rings, only to spend more generations burying them, stone by stone, until the hill is smooth again? One idea is ritual closure. In this view, an enclosure is not just a building, it's a being or a relationship with a life cycle. When its time is over, you don't just abandon it. You kill it properly. You fill it, seal it, return it to the earth the pillars rose from. The careful packing becomes a kind of final embrace, a way of making sure the space doesn't simply decay, but is transformed. Another theory sees it as a generational reset. The hill may have hosted periodic renewals, with each major phase of building eventually buried to make room for the next. Covering an old enclosure could mark the end of an era, the closing of agreements, the retirement of particular lineages or ritual roles. New rings or new arrangements above would then arise over the graves of the old. There's also the possibility of conflict, inside or out. As social networks grew more complex across the region, not everyone may have agreed on who controlled the hill or what it should be used for. Some researchers have suggested that backfilling might represent a decision, perhaps by a victorious group, perhaps by a weary coalition, to neutralize a powerful but contested place. Bury the stones, and you bury the arguments attached to them. Related to that is the idea of concealment. If outsiders were beginning to move through the region more frequently, if population densities were rising, a hilltop studded with potent ancestral monuments might start to feel vulnerable. Hiding them under tons of rubble could protect them from desecration or from people who didn't share the same understandings. None of these explanations has overwhelming proof. Each fits some aspects of the evidence and struggles with others. The truth may have braided several motives together: reverence, politics, exhaustion, fear. And all of this is happening against a background that is itself shifting. The climate in the early Holocene is generally more stable and warmer than during the glacial millennia before, but it's not static. There are wetter and drier swings, changes in vegetation, fluctuations in the herds people depend on. At the same time, communities across the Fertile Crescent are experimenting more deeply with cereals and legumes, with managing stands of wild wheat and barley, with corralling animals. Göbekli Tepe does not sit in a vacuum. As the centuries pass, it's part of a world where subsistence is slowly tilting, from highly mobile foraging toward more anchored, resource-intensive lives. That doesn't mean a single drought or a single harvest failure caused the burial. It does mean the meaning and usefulness of a giant hilltop sanctuary could be changing as people's daily rhythms changed. It's in the middle of this long, complicated transition that someone, or many someones, made the decision. The big rings are done. The pillars will stand no more in open air. So they filled them. Load after load of stone and bone and broken tools, layer pressed on layer, enclosures that once echoed with voices and drum beats becoming tighter and darker, until there was no space left at all, the tops of the tallest T-shapes disappearing beneath a rising artificial mound. From a distance the hill would slowly smooth out. The dramatic depressions of the circles would vanish. To a traveller passing centuries later, it might look like nothing more than a rounded knoll, perhaps with a few smaller later structures near the surface, its deeper history completely invisible. In effect, Göbekli Tepe was turned into a sealed container, a monument that had organized the lives and imaginations of people for generations was converted, by their own hands, into a kind of time capsule. It held its silence through the spread of farming, the rise of cities, the birth of writing, the entire sweep of recorded history. For nearly 10,000 years the great circles slept under their armour of rubble, waiting for a farmer's plough in 1994 to scrape against stone, and for a curious archaeologist to climb a nondescript hill and start peeling back the layers of a burial the builders had meant to last forever. Göbekli Tepe went to sleep. But the story on that hill is only part of a much larger landscape. If you stand on the crest today and look out across the plains and low ridges of southeastern Turkey, you aren't just looking at empty fields. You're looking into what archaeologists now call Taş Tepeler, the stone hills. For a long time, Göbekli Tepe seemed like a one-off, a freak, a miracle hill, a site so far ahead of its time that it almost didn't fit into human history as we understood it. Hunter-gatherers, 50-ton stones, monumental rings, deliberate burial. Put together, it felt like a singular anomaly. But as survey teams fanned out across the region, following hints from old maps, local farmers and satellite images, a pattern began to emerge. Karahan Tepe, Seyberts, Sefer Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, at least a dozen sites, some already under excavation, others only identified through ground-penetrating radar and surface finds, are now known in this same part of the world, dating to roughly the same early Holocene window. They share a family resemblance with Göbekli Tepe. Karahan Tepe, about 35 kilometers away, is the clearest example so far. It sits in a more rugged, rocky setting cut into a limestone knoll. When excavations began there, archaeologists found something that felt almost like a cousin to Göbekli, but with its own personality. Instead of only freestanding circles on a hilltop, Karahan Tepe has deep, rock-cut spaces. One of the most striking is a long sunken chamber, its floor far below the surface, with T-shaped pillars rising from the bedrock itself, fixed like teeth in a jaw. Along one wall, a row of carved human heads projects from the stone, staring into the space. The iconography echoes Göbekli Tepe's world. T-shapes, animals, abstract motifs, but it also adds new elements. More explicitly human figures, more emphasis on carved faces peering out of the bedrock, a slightly different balance between animal power and human presence. And Karahan Tepe is not alone. Other hills in the Taş Tepeler region show circular or oval structures, pillar-like stones, carved shafts and chambers, traces of similar building techniques. Some have only been lightly tested, others are still just promising blips on survey maps. But taken together, they're eroding the idea that Göbekli Tepe was a solitary cathedral rising out of a forager's wilderness. Instead, it starts to look like one node in a regional network. Imagine not just one sacred hill, but a constellation of them, each with its own layout, its own favoured animals, its own local stories, and yet all sharing a recognisable architectural language. Broadly similar T-shaped pillars, preference for certain arrangements, recurring motifs like snakes, foxes, and abstract H-shapes or ladders. This changes the story. Göbekli Tepe is still extraordinary, but it's no longer a unique miracle dropped into history out of nowhere. It's part of a tradition, a culture, or perhaps a cluster of closely related cultures, who over many centuries developed and maintained a shared set of symbols and building practices across dozens of kilometres of landscape. If you think back to those scattered bands of early Holocene hunter-gatherers, this is exactly the sort of pattern you might expect as their networks grow denser. Different groups, occupying different valleys and ridges, might each anchor their identity to a particular hill. You're people of Karahan, they're people of Göbekli. Another band claims Sefer Tepe. Each place has its own rituals, its own founding stories, its own ancestral pillars. But the similarities between sites hint at something more. Movement. Maybe people didn't just visit their home hill. Maybe season after season, group after group, they moved between several of these stone hills, attending rituals, renewing alliances, exchanging marriage partners, gossip, and stories, all under the silent gaze of the same style of T-shaped beings. In that picture, Taş Tepeler becomes a pilgrimage landscape. Not pilgrimage in the later organised religious sense with scriptures and priestly hierarchies, but in a looser, older way. Periodic journeys to powerful places, routes that migrate with animals and ripening plants, linking sacred hills into circuits that mark the rhythm of a year or the turning of a life. Shared architecture and iconography would help anchor a shared identity. You might never meet most of the people who also carve T-pillars. You might not speak exactly the same dialect or tell the same versions of the myths. But when you arrive on a distant ridge and see that familiar flat-topped stone with arms folded across its body, that fox in profile, that looping snake, you know immediately, these are our kind of people. We understand the same signs. This also speaks to those fringe ideas we touched on earlier. When outsiders see Göbekli Tepe in isolation, it can be tempting to say, this is too advanced, someone else must have taught them, a lost civilization, visitors from somewhere else. But the more we fill in the Taş Tepeler map, the more human the story looks. We don't see one perfect finished blueprint stamped once and then lost. We see variation, experimentation, sites exploring different arrangements, different emphases, all within a shared repertoire. That's what cultural traditions look like when they evolve in real time among real communities. You don't need an unknown super civilization to explain it. You need people who are already very good at talking, remembering, imitating, and modifying what their neighbours do, which by 9600 BC our species absolutely was. And if you're curious to go deeper into this kind of long, winding human story, climate crises, bottlenecks, strange hills hiding stranger secrets, this is a good moment to mention that we've put together a book that expands on these themes in a slow, sleep-friendly way. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount for listeners who want something to drift off with after the episode. Back on the stone hills though, the expanding map raises another set of questions. If Göbekli Tepe is one node in a network, what were the rules of that network? Did different hills specialize in different kinds of rituals? Healing here, initiation there, ancestral feasts somewhere else? Were some more local, some more regional, maybe one or two drawing people from very far away? And how does all of this fit into the bigger picture that archaeologists are slowly assembling? Because at this point in the story we've walked through quarries and enclosures, looked up at carved animals, watched 50-ton stones rise, and then watched the same stones vanish back into carefully packed rubble. We've widened the lens from a single hill to an entire region of stone-studded ridges. Now we have to step back once more. In the next part, we'll pull together what mainstream archaeology is comfortable saying about all of this, what the evidence strongly supports, and separate it from the more speculative edges, the places where the data are thin and the possibilities are still wide open. So, what can we actually say with confidence about Göbekli Tepe and its sister hills? And where are we still very much in the dark? Let's start with the firm ground. First, the age. Multiple radiocarbon dates from different layers, labs, and samples converge on the same general window. The main monumental phase at Göbekli Tepe belongs in the early Holocene, roughly 9600 BC, and a bit before and after. We're not looking at a medieval structure with an older legend attached. We're not looking at something secretly built in the Bronze Age and misdated. The charcoal in the fill, the organic residues on floors, the stratigraphy of the hill itself, all line up. This is late hunter-gatherer, pre-pottery, pre-farming architecture. Second, the stones are real megaliths, shaped and moved by humans. There's occasionally a claim that maybe the T-pillars are just natural rock fins, or maybe erosion did most of the work. The geology doesn't support that. The pillars are quarried from the same limestone the hill is made of, but you can see the negative scars in the quarries where blocks were detached. You can trace half-finished pillars still attached to the bedrock. You can see the flint tools, the working floors, the chips. These are not accidents of nature that someone happened to decorate. They're deliberate planned shapes, carved in large numbers over centuries. Third, the hill was filled on purpose. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe did not gradually silt up from wind-blown dust, or collapse under their own weight, and then slowly disappear under natural landslide debris. The fill is a dense, heterogeneous mixture of broken stone, animal bones, flint flakes, and other cultural debris, packed snugly around once-standing pillars. In some places you can still see the clean cut of a pit dug down past older layers to bury a ring. It looks like episodes of deliberate backfilling done while the structures were still structurally sound. Fourth, the quarrying was local. We don't see evidence that stones were dragged from dozens of kilometres away. The main source of limestone is the very hill they were building on, and its immediate flanks. That doesn't make moving a 50-ton pillar easy, but it means the logistics are within the reach of coordinated local labour. People who know every crack in that ridge, who chip stone there every season, who refine their techniques over generations, those are the anchors in the story. Early date, human-made megaliths, intentional burial, local stone. As soon as we move into the why questions, the floor gets softer. We don't really know the function of Göbekli Tepe and the other stone hills. Temple is a convenient shorthand, but it comes loaded with later ideas. Priests, doctrines, stable gods that may not fit. The evidence we have points to places of gathering, of ritual, of feasting. There are huge quantities of animal bones, especially from wild game. There's little sign of day-to-day domestic life in the earliest levels. No ovens for daily bread, no dense trash of long-term settlement. That suggests these weren't ordinary villages. But beyond that, we're in the realm of inference. We also don't know what most of the symbols meant. Were the foxes clan emblems, spirit helpers, calendar markers? Were the snakes associated with rainfall, or the underworld, or just a powerful local animal everyone respected? Did the abstract H-shapes and ladders refer to constellations, or social ranks, or something else entirely? We can propose analogies from later cultures, from modern forager groups, from mythology around the world. But no carved inscription tells us this is the story of X, and no living tradition can be traced with confidence all the way back to these specific stones. The social organisation that made this all possible is also mostly invisible. To raise and carve these stones, you need more than muscle. You need planning, leadership, shared ideas about how things should look. You need agreements about who provides food for the workers, who decides when an enclosure is finished, who has the right to stand where when rituals are performed. The architecture hints at hierarchy, central pillars taller than the rest, entrances that control movement, spaces that feel more or less restricted. But whether that hierarchy was permanent or situational, tied to age, gender, mythic roles, or all of the above, we can't say with certainty. And then there's the biggest open question of all: why bury it? We know the burial was deliberate. We don't know the motive. Was it about closure, ritually killing, an old sacred space when its time was done? Was it practical, stabilizing the hill, or clearing the surface for new constructions higher up? Was it connected to shifts in belief, in climate, in economy? Perhaps as people began to experiment more seriously with cultivation and herding, the old way of doing ritual at Göbekli Tepe no longer fit, and the safest thing, symbolically and socially, was to fold the old stones back into the earth. These are real mysteries, and it's natural that your mind might reach for a big, neat solution. This is where the phrase lost civilization often walks into the room. Standing in front of a 6-meter tall pillar carved by hunter-gatherers, many people think, how could they do this without help? Maybe an earlier advanced culture taught them how. Maybe that culture vanished, leaving only hints like these. It's an understandable reaction. Our brains like teachers. We don't like to imagine that a community we might dismiss as simple could invent such complexity on its own. But when archaeologists actually dig into the dirt, the pattern doesn't demand a hidden super-civilization. Instead of a single older blueprint appearing fully formed and then being lost, we see gradual change. Earlier, smaller structures underlie later, more imposing ones. Toolkits evolve. People get better at quarrying, at shaping stone, at organizing space. Nearby sites show related but not identical experiments. Over hundreds of years, skills spread and mutate. That's what cultural evolution looks like when it's happening in plain sight. We also don't see the physical footprint we'd expect from a truly advanced predecessor. No large cities, no metalworking, no long-distance road systems or massive harbour works from a much earlier date. The remains we do have, lithic scatters, hearths, animal bones, belong to forager societies that are already very capable, very social, and very good at manipulating their environments. So, do we know that no other culture ever influenced these people? We can't make that kind of absolute negative claim, but we can say that the evidence we do have is fully compatible with innovation by late Pleistocene and early Holocene humans. using brains and bodies like ours. We don't need a lost teacher to explain Göbekli Tepe. We need time, tradition, and the kind of stubborn creativity that shows up again and again across human history. How will archaeology move the needle on these questions? Not by waiting for a single dramatic discovery that explains everything at once, but by slowly tightening the web of evidence. New excavations at other Tashtapela sites will let us compare sequences. Does Karahan Tepe, for example, show the same pattern of building and burying? Are there hills with clear signs of domestic life right next to ritual spaces, or are they always separate? Each trench adds another sliver of context. Improved dating techniques, like more precise radiocarbon calibration and optically stimulated luminescence for sediments, help us refine timelines. Did the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe overlap in use, or did they follow one after another like chapters in a book? Did the burial episodes coincide with broader climatic shifts we can see in lake cores and cave stalagmites? Residue studies can sometimes tell us what was actually happening on a floor. Microscopic analysis of sediments can reveal traces of plant processing, pigments, even blood and fat. If we find consistent clusters, say, repeated evidence of beer-like fermentation or specific plants used in feasting, that adds texture to our picture of ritual life. Regional surveys using drones, satellite imagery and geophysics will continue to map the wider landscape. Where were the everyday camps and villages that supplied these hills? How far did people travel to reach them? Were there paths, gathering points, seasonal rhythms that stitch the whole region into a coherent social fabric? All of this loops back to that tension we've been circling throughout the episode. Mobile lifeways, monumental commitments. Göbekli Tepe and its cousins sit right on the edge between worlds. On one side, the older pattern, small flexible groups moving with herds and seasons, carrying their belongings with them. On the other, a newer pattern, enduring places, heavy investments in stone and story, landscapes that tell you where to go and what matters most. The people of the Stone Hills seem to be living both ways at once. They are still hunters, still foragers, still deeply plugged into the movements of wild animals and wild plants. But they are also investing staggering effort into places that do not move, into architecture that will outlast them by many generations. We don't yet know exactly how they reconciled that tension in their daily lives. We just know that for a few centuries they did, and in the end they left us stones, not explanations. No carved narrative telling us what each animal meant. No final inscription saying why they chose to bury their pillars, why they finally walked away. Just rings of limestone sleeping under their own rubble, waiting millennia for someone to peel back the layers. What we know is enough to sketch the outlines of their world. What we don't know leaves the centre of that world open, quiet, full of possible meanings, like the empty space between two T-pillars in a dim, stone-ringed chamber. In the last part of this story, we'll follow that silence to its edge and stand on the hill as the last stones are covered, the last fires go out, and Göbekli Tepe fades from living memory. Imagine the hilltop at dusk. The wind has dropped. The heat of the day is leaking out of the limestone. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a flock of cranes is settling for the night, their calls thinning into distance. Up here, where the grass runs thin and the soil is shallow, nothing looks especially remarkable. To your left, a low swell in the ground, hardly more than a wrinkle. To your right, a scatter of broken stone. Under your feet, small chips of flint you'd overlook if you weren't already tuned to see them. Beneath all of this, the pillars. 6-meter T-shapes standing in the dark, shoulder to shoulder with the compacted bones of animals, the flakes of broken tools, the ash from feasts long cooled. Foxes and snakes and cranes carved in relief, their stories folded inward, pressed into silence by tons of backfill. Once people gathered here from miles around. Small bands, maybe a few dozen souls at a time, slipping out of their winter valleys or upland camps to converge on this stony ridge. They brought meat and hides, obsidian and fine flint, songs and stories. For centuries they raised circles, renewed them, walked through their ritual seasons. They touched the central pillars, lit fires nearby, watched shadows slide across carved backs and animal reliefs as the year turned. And then, without any catastrophe we can see, they changed their minds about the place. They did not just abandon the hill to weather and time, they filled it. They took the bones and broken tools and rubble of their own lives and poured them into the enclosures. They tamped the soil in around the pillars until the carvings disappeared, until the T-shapes were sealed like thoughts you decide one day not to share anymore. New structures rose higher up, smaller, squarer, closer to the emerging world of herding and cultivation. Eventually those too went quiet. One day, the last fire burned down. The last person walked away. Grass took the surface. The hill slept. When Klaus Schmidt and his team arrived in the 1990s, they met only that sleeping hill. Everything else had to be coaxed back into the light, grain by grain. We've followed that arc tonight. A gathering place built by mobile communities before farming, used over generations, then carefully buried by the same hands that raised it. If you've drifted through this story with me, I'd love to know where you're listening from. A city apartment, a farm, a dorm room, a night shift break room on the other side of the world. Tell me in the comments. And if you'd like more journeys like this, it helps a lot if you tap like subscribe to the channel and leave a comment before sleep pulls you under. It's a small action on your end, but it tells the algorithm that quiet, curious history is worth showing to other people. If you want to go deeper into these kinds of prehistoric mysteries, I've put together a book about the hidden, stranger-than-fiction chapters of our deep past. Stories like Göbekli Tepe, Denisovans, Ice Age bottlenecks, and more. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. That's also where I post updates, bonus chapters, and for now there's a discount this week if you're listening near when this episode comes out. Standing here, at the end of our climb, it's tempting to demand answers. What exactly did each animal mean? Why this hill and not the next one over? Why bury the circles instead of leaving them to crumble? But maybe part of the power of Göbekli Tepe lies in how much it withholds. We know enough to see that people like us, with brains like ours, committed to something bigger than their immediate needs. Art, story, shared space. We can trace the outline of their labour, the rhythm of build and bury, the movement from pure hunting to the first hints of farming. The rest is an open field between the pillars. So as you sink into sleep, you might let one last question hang in that space. When our own monuments, our own cities and screens and towers are long gone, what single hill or building or carved surface would you want some distant future excavator to find? And what story do you hope they'd tell about the kind of people we were